There's some more room over here if you'd like to move around. Those in the rear, you can move over here. Pardon? Yeah. It's 2:30, and in order to preserve our reputation for staying on schedule, we'll get started now. Distinguished guests and fellow molten salt enthusiasts, I hope you can hear me, even though that speaker sends reverberations all around. This building here is over 15 years old, and it has seen at least one reactor come and go, and part of another. But I doubt that it has ever seen as many people in it as we have here today. I'm sure it has never seen so many who have contributed so much to making the molten salt project a success. There are so many, in fact, that it would be impossible to single out the individuals for the recognition which they so richly deserve. So I'd like to say simply on behalf of those of us who work here that we're very happy that you came to be with us on this occasion. You're all aware of why we are here this afternoon. It is to watch the first power operation with uranium-233 fuel. Most of you are familiar with how we came to be at this point because you contributed a great deal to bringing us here, to the chain of events that has ended at this point. One might say that the chain that leads up to this point began back in 1942, back at Berkeley, when a team of scientists discovered the new isotope of uranium, U233. So we are especially happy this afternoon to have two of that team with us, two of the co-discoverers of uranium-233, Ray Stoughton and Glenn Seaborg. Today, we are all confident that from uranium-233, man will eventually derive a great fraction of the energy that he needs in the future. And many of us here are convinced that molten salt reactors will be the most economical means of deriving that energy from U233. No applause, please. The reason for our confidence rests in no small part on the performance of the MSRE. So I would like to review very briefly for you what that record has been. 8 years ago, our picture of what an economical molten salt power reactor should look like was just coming into focus. The picture looked very good on paper and in the laboratory, but we had to have a reactor to prove our ideas. And that was the beginning of the molten salt reactor experiment. It was just 4 years ago this month that we first loaded salt into the reactor tanks. By the following spring, we began adding uranium to the salt, and on June 1st of 1965, the reactor was critical for the first time. When we began power operation, we encountered a few minor problems. One of them convinced us we needed a large filter in our off-gas line, but by May of 1966, we had reached full power of 8,000 kilowatts thermal. But we weren't quite out of the woods yet, and our operation that summer and in the fall were interrupted by trouble with one of our air cooling blowers and some salt that we'd gotten into some of the gas lines. But by December of '66, these problems had been taken care of and the reactor was ready to go. And from that point on, the MSRE ran up a record that was truly remarkable for a first-of-its-kind system. Between December 66 and this past March, and over the 15-month period, the reactor was critical 80% of the time. And this operation was climaxed by a 6-month run in which the fuel salt was in the core continuously, and the reactor was critical for 98% of the time. By last March, the total energy released in the reactor had amounted to 9,000 equivalent full power hours, equivalent of more than a year at full power. Out of these long hours of operation, there had emerged a very favorable picture of the molten salt reactor. Nowhere was there any sign of a basic flaw in the concept. From the standpoint of chemistry and neutronics, mechanical engineering, the reactor appeared to be a success. At that point, then, we could say that the original objectives of the reactor had been attained, but the usefulness of the MSRE as an experiment had by no means been used up. What we planned to do next was to strip the uranium from the salt and replace it with uranium-233. A supply of U-233 had become available after our original startup. As a matter of fact, we had no competitors for it because it had so much U-232 in it that it represented quite a handling problem, a radiation problem. It wasn't quite the problem for us that it might have been if we had to fabricate fuel elements. What we wanted was a concentrated uranium fluoride salt that we could use to spike the salt that was still in the reactor. Our chemical technology people set up process equipment in one of the hot cells over at the turf building to do the job. There they prepared about a half a cubic foot of salt that contained the 35 kilograms of U-235 that we needed to refuel the MSRE. Of course, before we added this salt, we needed to get the old uranium out. And this we were set up to do right here in the building. As a matter of fact, I'm standing on the roof of the cell in which the processing was done. We stripped the uranium from the salt by the fluoride volatility process, which means that we put the 5 tons of uranium into a tank under here and bubble fluorine gas through it, bringing the uranium off as uranium hexafluoride. Now this object here behind me is one of the absorbers on which we recovered the UF6. It is typical of a number that came out of there. It has 14 kilograms of uranium in it, and it reads less than 2 MR per hour at the surface. The point of that is simply that the very simple fluoride volatility process was quite effective in decontaminating uranium. With the old uranium out of the way, we began adding U-233 to the stripped carrier salt 4 weeks ago today. We began by adding 30 kilograms of uranium through equipment that was set up in the drain tank cell to my right. After we had that in, we removed that equipment, sealed up the containment, and now are adding uranium in 96-gram batches directly to the circulating salt. Well, this brings our review up to the present. It only takes a very brief glimpse at the future to understand why we went to all the trouble of removing perfectly good uranium and putting in some other. The reason, of course, is that the whole operation of the MSRE is but one step toward the molten salt breeder reactor. The long-range use of U-233 that I spoke of at the beginning. Of the 3 fissile materials that could be used in this type of reactor, it appears that uranium-233 will be the most economical and the most desirable. And we would use it in a reactor that was designed to breed. Our concept of a molten salt breeder now looks very much like a scaled-up MSRE. And so we are confident then that the computational tools that we used so successfully to predict the nuclear performance of the MSRE will be equally successful in predicting the breeder performance, provided we have good fundamental data. Now, the data for U233 is in pretty good shape, so we say that we are confident of the breeder characteristics. But the fact remained that no one had ever operated a reactor with U233 before. And so we believed, and the AEC concurred, that we should operate the MSRE with the kind of fissile material that we expect to use in the breeders. Well, what will we learn from the operation with U233? Well, we expect to learn that our calculations were good and that the MSRE is easy to control despite the very low fraction of delayed neutrons afforded by U233. We also expect to make some very accurate and consequently very valuable measurements of the fission neutron yield from U233 in a neutron flux that has the same energy spectrum as the breeders that we're looking forward to. To make this measurement, we need to operate at high power for a period of several months while we look very carefully at the ratio of uranium-233 to U-234. To operate at high power for several months, of course, implies that we have a reliable system that we can keep running. The question is, can we do it? Well, those of us around here think we can, because most of us know that MSRE stands not only for molten salt reactor experiment, but also for mighty smooth running experiment. I'd like to on that parting note, I'd like to turn the chair over to Murray Rosenthal, the director of the program.
We invited all of you here today to join us to mark the startup of the MSRE with U233. Of course, starting up the world's first U233 reactor is a great event of great significance. But several equally significant events that Paul has mentioned have got us to the point that we're at today. One has been the remarkably successful operation of the MSRE, of which you're all aware. The second has been the processing of the fuel in the cell below us here to produce uranium, which is so clean that we can have it sitting behind us here. The third has been the preparation of the charge of fuel for the reactor, which is now in it, making it out of some U233 that had so much radiation generating U232 in it, I don't believe anyone else would ever want to use it. As a result of the success of these operations and of the success we've had in other parts of the research and development program, I for one am convinced that much of the world's power and energy in the future is going to come from molten salt breeder reactors. We've been making lots of speeches and writing about molten salt breeder reactors and how well they're going to perform. And each time we dutifully list three advantages of molten salt breeders. One has to do with economics, one with fuel utilization, one with safety. There's a fourth advantage of which I am constantly aware. Perhaps it's unfair for molten salt reactors to have it, but it is the dedicated and very highly competent people who operate the MSRE and the equally dedicated and competent people, among which are most of you here, that support its operation. 11 divisions of the laboratory are working on activities which relate to and support molten salt reactors. Among these is one which you might overlook if you're listing them, and that's the Directors Division. I might comment that the inspiration and guidance we get out of the management of the laboratory has really been one of the molten salt reactor program's greatest asset, for which we're very grateful. Back about 3 years ago, when the molten salt reactor experiment had not yet begun to operate, but yet people were beginning to make speeches about its great promise, Beecher Briggs recognized some of the problems that people who worked on the reactor, and he recognized that a cartoon he had seen epitomized their problem. I think most of you have seen this. If I can read it to you, to those in the back, it says, and this is Lionel speaking, "There's no heavier burden than a great potential." Now, I really think we've passed the point today of being concerned about burden of the great potential, and another cartoon character in his happy mood perhaps best represents how we feel today. So I want to present the MSRE with a new symbol as of today. Well, we're pleased to have Dr. Weinberg speak to us next.
Murray said that the director's division was a source of great inspiration and guidance. He neglected to say that it is not a source of money for the molten salt reactor business. I first heard about the possibility of U233 being used as the fuel in a breeder reactor some 25 years ago. This was in May of 1943, when Dr. James Conant, who at the time was a scientific advisor to Vannevar Bush, who was the president's scientific advisor during the war, sent a memorandum which finally filtered its way down to Professor Wigner and then to me as the person who made this sort of calculation. And Dr. Conant was asking, is it possible that the Germans, whom we knew were working on nuclear energy, could possibly get hold of a small amount of U-233, and by means of the bootstrap operation, which after 25 years of very hard work we are finally beginning to get after, would be able to manufacture enough bred U-233 to make bombs that could then be dropped on New York City. And we dutifully made all the calculations. We did realize that the eta of U-233 seemed to be surprisingly high, and we concluded, no, that was unlikely. But we said with a few more years of work, this might become a possibility. And those few words have few years have lengthened into 25 years, gray hair. We see the specter of retirement facing us. But we feel that we have the thing finally going, and that all of us here will, we hope, be around to see the first successful, well, I would say first economically successful breeder reactor, which I still believe will be the U233 breeder reactor. I want to add my word of thanks to all of those who have been involved in the great success of the molten salt reactor experiment, the members of the various divisions who are represented here, the representatives of the service divisions. I want particularly to recognize the very great help that we've received from the other carbide installations here on the area, represented by Mr. Hibbs. Remind you that the tank was fabricated here at the Y-12 shops. I would like at this time to introduce some of the distinguished people who are here, as they say, at the head table. My boss, Dr. Clarence Larson, Ernie Wendy, Deputy Manager, Oak Ridge Operations, and Beecher Briggs, whom I don't have to introduce to all of you, the genius who did so much of the engineering design of the molten salt reactor experiment, and who is charged always with the responsibility of keeping us administrators honest when we talk about the molten salt reactor and its great potential. I would like also at this time to introduce Mr. Willard Johnson. You can stand up, Bill. Commissioner, U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, and one of those who has consistently supported the idea of the U-233 breeder. I would like now to identify those two anonymous scientists who were mentioned by Paul Haubenreich, the ones who were the inventors of U-233. And first I would like to recognize Ray Stoughton, and finally, the distinguished chairman of the United States Atomic Energy Commission and discoverer of some, how many elements is it, Glenn? More elements than we would care to list, but particularly one of the co-discoverers of U-233. And I would like to add here, Glenn, that I have my little bet book handy, and I think I'd be willing to make book that 15 years from now, you will agree with me that your discovery of U-233 was in fact the most important of all of your discoveries. It is a very great pleasure for me to introduce the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Glenn Seaborg.
Thank you. Dr. Weinberg, Dr. Larson, Commissioner Johnson, and other distinguished guests, thank you very much, Al, for your very unbiased analysis of the significance of my discoveries. It's always a pleasure to visit the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I find it very exciting. This visit is no exception. I've just come from a tour of your heavy isotopes, your trench uranium research laboratory, and I found much that was new and much that interested me in the course of that visit. It's also a pleasure to see what amounts to my former colleagues, the members of your visiting advisory committee on chemical technology, a committee upon which I served some 10 or 12 years ago, at which time I was also serving on the advisory committee for the Division of Chemistry. And I recall that it was at about that time that we advised your director, Alvin Weinberg, that it might be a good idea to enter the field of heavy ion trench uranium research. And I must say that you took our advice very seriously, and you certainly have made a great start in that direction in the way you are operating today. Now, it's a great pleasure for me to play this role in the dedication, in the first loading of the molten salt reactor experiment with the isotope uranium-233. This first loading is going to be an important development in evaluating the potential, the future potential, the long-range potential of the molten salt reactor systems for the commercial production of electricity. It is exciting, of course, to see this union of the more or less small shoestring experiment that we performed at Berkeley some 27 or 28 years ago with the modern nuclear technology. Now, when we recall the times and circumstances surrounding the discovery of uranium-233 and compare it with the way nuclear research is conducted today, we can appreciate the tremendous advances that have occurred during the last 27 or 28 years. And one of these, of course, is in the degree to which we can find support now in the federal government for the advance of nuclear science. Actually, the birth of the isotope uranium-233 goes back to its beginning some 28 years ago, when in the fall of 1940, in the fall semester of 1940 at the University of California at Berkeley, I was looking for a graduate student who would work with me in a search for what was then the potential isotope, uranium-233. I thought that this would make a fine and I hoped adequate thesis problem for some graduate students. And fortunately for the project, and fortunately for me, and for the future of the breeding of thorium, Jack Goffman and I found each other. And now I had his able assistance, and he had a dissertation problem. Now, one thing Jack didn't have was a stipend for research. His sole income, and I'll come back to this later, was the money he earned as a teaching assistant. My own salary at the time, all of which came from the University of California as payment for my role as an instructor, was $200 a month. But even that seemed like a luxurious salary, having just squeezed through the Depression. Now, as for equipment, we of course had the use of the 60-inch cyclotron that had recently been built by Ernest Lawrence and his co-worker. We also had some invaluable help from Joe Kennedy, who was a veritable genius on counting techniques. And it was Joe Kennedy who developed the instrumentation that enabled us to detect the alpha particles in the presence of the intense beta radiation, and which detection demonstrated the existence of the isotope uranium-233 that we were looking for. And Joe and I were also office roommates while we were working on uranium-233. We shared an office that today wouldn't exactly seem to you people as a place with which we would be trying to impress you. But at that time, I thought it was luxurious. And it was by comparison to some of the facilities I'd used in my initial work in nuclear chemistry, which at times had included an old abandoned building on the Berkeley campus, and later and earlier in what I think must have been a janitor's washroom. In one small room, Joe Kennedy and I had our desks and the file cabinets and a workbench and counters and electrometers and alpha counters and fission counters, and somehow we didn't feel a bit crowded. So as the 1940-41 academic year began, Jack Goffman and I, with the help of Joe Kennedy, began our work. After answering some preliminary questions, we began to produce uranium-233 by irradiating thorium in the neutron beam of Lawrence's cyclotron. By the end of the spring semester, our observations of alpha particles from our uranium fraction, isolated from a 1 kilogram sample of thorium, so irradiated with neutrons, convinced us that we had found our isotope. But in order to establish the fission properties of uranium-233, we felt that we needed to produce a still larger sample. Then something incredible happened, at least incredible by today's standards, something that would never happen today on such an important research project. The work had to be discontinued because we didn't have enough money to pay a research assistant over the summer. We didn't have the $100 or $200 that would have been Jack Goffman's sole source of support. His livelihood depended only on his teaching assistantship, which came to an end at the end of the spring semester, and I was unable to scrape up the money to pay Jack for working in the laboratory during the summer. There weren't even any off-campus jobs available that would have permitted him to stay in Berkeley and work in the laboratory without pay. So Jack had to go back to Cleveland to live with his family until his teaching assistantship became available again in the fall. Meanwhile, the plutonium work had become so urgent that I couldn't continue the uranium-233 work all by myself. and consequently the research for this fantastic new source of energy was held up for the summer of 1941 because we lacked only a couple of $100 that was required to keep it going. But in the fall of 1941, things changed for the better. Not only did Jack Goffman come back, but I also got a $3,000 grant from the United States government that enabled me to add to our uranium-233 team Dr. Raymond W. Stoughton, who is with us this afternoon and is sitting in the front row here, who served as a research chemist and whose fine work on the chemical processing was absolutely essential in the final success of our project. And as you know, Ray Stoughton has been a valued member of your chemistry staff here at Oak Ridge ever since 1943, after spending a year or so at the wartime metallurgical laboratory, now the Argonne National Laboratory. As soon as possible, we put about 3 kilograms of thorium nitrate in the cyclotron's neutron beam. And by February 2nd, 1942, the night of February 2nd in the early morning of the following day, we had chemically isolated 4 micrograms of uranium-233. And in that day, of course, this was a huge sample. And we took this to the cluttered room that I described earlier, where we were able to identify during that night the alpha particle decay that is characteristic of uranium-233. That was, we identified that we had uranium-233, and from the intensity of the alpha radioactivity that we had 4 micrograms of the uranium-233. And then that same night and early the next morning, we determined its fissionability. And this, of course, was the important property that we were seeking to confirm. And I might add that a later experiment showed the half-life of the isotope to be about 100,000 years, a very satisfactory half-life for the purposes that we had in mind. Now, the primary significance of uranium-233, of course, is that this man-made isotope of this man-made element opens up the vast amount of energy stored in thorium-232, which is so abundant in nature. The role of uranium-233 that has already been described by the previous speakers. Uranium-233 and plutonium-239. Plutonium-239, of course, similarly opens up the energy of the abundant but non-fissionable uranium-238. When these are added to the relatively more scarce but fissionable isotope uranium-235, they make the nucleus of the atom a virtually unlimited source of energy. Just as it's possible to visualize that the world might be running out of fossil fuels, it's also possible to visualize running out of economically recoverable uranium-235. But it's not easy to conceive of exhausting nature's supply of uranium-238 or thorium-232, each of which is about 100 times as abundant as uranium-235. And in the United States alone, the value of the energy that could be derived from our reserves of uranium-238 and thorium-232 through the plutonium-239 and uranium-233 fuel cycles, if we measure it in terms of what it would cost to produce an equivalent amount of energy from fossil fuels, is probably something of the order of $1 quadrillion for each of those two fuels. Quadrillion, million, billion, trillion, quadrillion dollars. The key to making the most effective use of nature's supply of nuclear fuels is, of course, the breeder reactor. Breeders will make it economical to use relatively high-cost ores as sources of fuel and will therefore greatly extend the world's supply of economically usable uranium-238 and thorium-232. The AEC's program to develop breeder reactors now gives the highest priority to the liquid metal-cooled fast breeder reactor. But we are also investigating other concepts that appear to have an important potential for breeding. And of course, one of these is the molten salt breeder reactor, and the molten salt breeder experiment here at Oak Ridge and the program contemplated here at Oak Ridge are the major parts of our molten salt reactor program. The molten salt reactor, with its thermal neutron spectrum and fluid fuel system and thorium-uranium-233 fuel cycle, could turn out to be a strong system for parallel development or an excellent backup to the liquid metal fast breeder reactor with its fast neutron spectrum and its solid fuel system and the uranium-plutonium fuel cycle. In loading uranium-233 in the molten salt reactor experiment, we are taking an important step toward developing many of the materials and the design features of breeders for actual use in an operating reactor. At the present stage of development, the molten salt breeder concept merits investigation for a number of important reasons. Its fuel inventory costs would be low, and there would be essentially no cost for fuel fabrication. And it was just pointed out to you, the entire chemical separation plant is in this little cubicle just below where I'm standing, and I understand that this would be essentially large enough to process the fuel from a 1,000 electrical megawatt reactor. Its fuel inventory costs would be low, and there would be essentially no costs for fuel fabrication, as I've indicated. So far, the molten salt reactor experiment has operated successfully and has earned a reputation for reliability. Although too much development work remains to be done in breeder reactors for us to make confident predictions, some people believe that the molten salt thermal concept will provide the quickest and the least expensive route to competitive commercial power from breeder reactors. In any event, I think that someday the world will have commercial power reactors of both the uranium, plutonium, and the thorium-uranium fuel cycle types. Now, regardless of which breeder concept or concepts eventually become the basis for future commercial nuclear power stations, the advent of the breeder will have far-reaching effects on the production and the cost and the utilization of nuclear energy. With low-cost nuclear power available in large amounts, as Al Weinberg has pointed out, a new age of energy-intensive industrial technology could be opened up. And some of the concepts that are being studied here at Oak Ridge, such as the agro-industrial complex investigated by Professor E.O. Mason and Dr. R.F. Hammond and their many able associates, could be brought closer to reality with a breeder such as the molten salt breeder. Now, back in 1941 and 1942, during the work leading to the discovery of plutonium and uranium-233, it would have been difficult to visualize the progress that has been made up until now. At that time, not many scientists would have believed that the nuclear establishments of both the federal government and private enterprise would have grown to be as large and diversified as they are today, or that nuclear power plants would be competitive with fossil fuel power plants in the generation of electricity in so many parts of our country and throughout the world, or that nuclear energy would be a practical and economic reality in so many other different ways, or that in only a generation after 1942, we would be within 15 years or so of producing commercial electricity in breeder reactors. Now, in conclusion, I'm tremendously gratified at seeing uranium-233, discovered 27 short years ago, being more closely linked with the great energy technology of the future. We are now on the threshold of making tremendous advances in the amount of energy that can be obtained economically from nature. This first loading of the molten salt reactor experiment with uranium-233 may lead to some highly significant developments in the history of nuclear energy technology. Those of you who have worked on this molten salt reactor project have our praise and our gratitude for a job well done. Thank you very much.
In just a few minutes, we'll be going, Chairman Seaborg will be going into the control room where we're going to teach him a little bit more about the molten salt reactor and then allow him to, if you will, take the reactor to power. But before we do that, I have a couple of mementos here that I would like to give. As Dr. Weinberg mentioned, Commissioner Johnson has been a visitor here before and has taken a lively interest in our project, particularly in the fuel cycle and processing. And Commissioner Johnson, I have something here I'd like to give you. This, sir, is some of the uranium that we recovered from the fuel in this cell here just below. Those are sodium fluoride pellets. If you look at them closely, you can see they have a yellow color to them on the surface at any rate. This is the UF6. I don't think our accountability people will mind if you take that with you. As you have heard, of course, Chairman Seaborg has been very closely associated with uranium-233 from its discovery. And in thinking of an appropriate memento for him, we thought about just giving him a capsule as a material. But of course that would present quite severe radiation problems and others. So we thought the next best thing would be to give him an empty capsule in which the uranium had been at one time but had been added to the reactor. So the first capsule of uranium-233 that was added, we recovered the capsule after it had been in the reactor, and we have been working since to prepare him a gift. I'd like to give him a gift right now. Before I give this to you, though, I think that in view of our maintaining the credibility position we have with AEC, that I have to explain what it is I'm giving you. You know, there is a saying in the reactor business that it's the conventional things that trip you up. And we succeeded in putting a capsule of U233 in the reactor and getting the capsule back out and decontaminating it, but we had a little trouble with the plastic in which we were embedding it cracking. So this is the practice piece that was made up. And it doesn't crack, but the one that we want to give to you will be a little later in arriving, so we'll deliver it to you, but for the present, we'd like to present you with this, sir.
I just want to say I appreciate this, but I also would just as soon that it wasn't loaded with uranium-233 for two reasons. One is I think it'd be a little hard for me to handle on my desk, or at least not a very good place for it. And the other is that I think the right place for the uranium-233 is here in the molten salt reactor experiment. Thank you very much.
I mentioned before that we had been adding uranium for some weeks, and the reactor has been critical. We've taken it critical briefly just to determine the critical rod position and so on, and then we have taken the power up very briefly to the order of 2 to 5 kilowatts in the course of measuring rod sensitivity. But we've never operated steadily in the kilowatt range, and today we want to take the power up to about 100 kilowatts. We have great confidence in our system, and you know, our friends in the AEC safety branch here want to be sure that we always have qualified operators. So we're going to give Chairman Seaborg a short training course. Dick Engel, will you come up, please? Dick will take Chairman Seaborg into the control room and train him, and it will be probably 5 minutes before we're ready to go. But as most of you realize, why don't you take Seaborg on here? Familiarize him with the control. As most of you realize, it will be impossible to get a very good view through the window of the control room. So our people here in the I&C division have set up a closed circuit television, and the operators promptly named it Big Brother, but it was looking over the shoulder of the operator there. And when we get these big bright lights out, you can see a little better. And I think that most of you would find that if you remain out here, you'll get a better picture of what's going on in the control room than you possibly could out in the corridor. I'll be in there trying to explain it play-by-play. In a few minutes, we ought to see the new operator arriving. So I'll go in there and pick up the microphone.
Did you get the lights, Skip?
Reactor is under automatic control by a servo mechanism. Although at the present time it is subcritical.
Come on, Ray.
We are subcritical at the present time. Two control rods have been withdrawn. The third control rod will have to be withdrawn to make the reactor critical to bring it up to power. As I said, the system is under servo control. The servo mechanism will take the reactor to power as you allow it. The control rod to be moved is this one. You see the force indication on the left hand, 1 dial, the fine indication is here. This dial makes one complete revolution every 6 minutes. Right now, as I said, the servo is holding it. The servo is attempting to bring the reactor up to the demanded power of 100 kilowatts. In a moment, we will be moving this rod. Now, actually, the servo is limited to about
Can you? Yes, okay.
Where will it be on board there? As the critical rate goes up.
That middle recorder over there.
Little chart.
Yeah, and then later it'll be up on this one. Those of you who are watching the TV, those of you who are watching the TV screen will be able to see the operator as he puts his hand on the control rod and begins removing the one rod that is still in the reactor. The three dials are the control rod positions. We're slightly subcritical now. The number one control rod will be withdrawn slowly to the critical position.
After each movement of the rod, the multiplication causes the neutron flux to increase. You're looking now on your screen at the logarithmic power chart. The pen spans about, well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 7 or 8 decades there. And it will be going up slowly as the multiplication increases. Once the reactor is critical, it will continue to rise. Here is the logarithmic power indicator, which shows that the multiplication has already increased by about a factor of 20 to 50, something like that. Very smooth for a first time. The power now is still only about 100 watts. We've got about a factor of 1,000 to go, but it's coming on up. Reactor is slightly supercritical now. Reactor is approaching 10 kilowatts. The linear power instrument has come on scale now. Power is about 50, 60. The power has leveled now at about 100 kW. The automatic pilot or servo system is operating the rod to hold it. We're going to switch to manual control. Hold the power there. The power is now the reactor is now operating steadily at 90 kilowatts. The power is steady now at manual. We'll switch back to servo and see what happens. I believe our manual operator is a little better than our servo. Not as nervous. Servo system is settled down now. This concludes our ceremony.